It's on? Yeah. So we've had sort of a series of different presentations. Part of the goal that we've been trying today is to open up the question, what's the social, right, for AKBC? And we've had lots of different angles on it, and we've had several different presentations now. So I think first let's just open up the floor for whatever it is that you want to comment on or ask. Comments are welcome just as much as questions. And then I have some prompts if we have any hesitations.
So one of the things that I think I struggle with when we implement these systems is that data we know is a social process, right? It exists in context, but to work with it, even if we use very advanced methods, we always end up chopping off that context. It's really hard to encode all of that. We get rid of that. So, and I saw that discussion going back and forth. You saw the implications of context and not having context. So what's your view on where do we have ways of delineating that context? When can I chop off the context, right? So to make it easier for my, to write an algorithm. That's the thing that keeps coming up in my head, and I don't have an answer, so maybe you guys do.
So you might know what I'm going to say, but say, I suppose what you're referring to are tools like model cards and data sheets that document some of those processes, right? So we went through several stages. We understood across different technology community, data communities that context needs to be captured, perhaps in a different way with a different focus at a different level of detail than the regular technical documentation you write for software on GitHub. Say we have that, we know that, we see data sets as resources, and they're documented in many communities. For me, it's less a question of saying, okay, this is the right level of detail, this is the structure of that data sheet, and it has to be 5 pages, and it needs to consider this and this and this, as it is a question of establishing processes and practices for those resources that capture that context in whatever way, natural language or otherwise, to be co-created and maintained both by those who have created the data and published it and those who used it. And to just give an example, I mean, I'd love to have something that isn't just papers with code, which is a great invention, but where the code and the data and the resources documenting that those data sets are maintained by everyone who has ever used that data set. And we could do it in natural language if that's the most accessible or inclusive way for everyone who uses that data set. Or we could link to other resources. We're web people, so linking is a good way to organize things and make sure that you find them. So I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all. I think if you have a data set like Wikidata, which is now increasingly used in social sciences research, you will not be able to use things like Sparkle or other tools to explore the data set and the context. Say it's about involving the users of the data set to contribute to that institutional knowledge about how the data set was created, published, used, what are the limitations, what are the differences between different versions, and then perhaps create tools on top of that rich documentation.
So I have a thought, I think it's sort of related to your question. So I'd broadly say, again, thinking in terms of what could be the outcome of something like this gathering, right? So I always think of education as one. And actually, you heard the fact that we have a humanities professor at the College of Engineering. When I went to College of Engineering, and we had a humanities department, but certainly not the kind of things you were talking about. So one question, I guess, broadly to the group, for all of you all to think about is, what do you want to teach the kids in data science, right? Are there some principles from here that Data Science 101, in fact, I've been wanting to go back and look at Berkeley's 101 data science and see how much, do they cover this, how much, etc. So that's one general comment. The other is, even in the context of working, I mentioned that provenance came up as a big deal, okay? But the question I have for myself is, how much do people really care about it? The user, right? And that's a chicken and egg problem, I think, in the sense, suppose I get a search result, and then there's a button there that says, you want to find out how this search result came? I might very well click on it. But today when I get search results, I don't get such buttons, so why do I care, right? I just say, it looks like a reasonably good answer, so I use my own judgment and say, that looks like a good search result. So I think the chicken and egg there is maybe if we gave, and I think this falls in the realm of maybe some research projects should be done. And again, an OKN kind of environment could be a research platform to test out these things. Even in our meetings, even in the innovation sprints, people like Kevin Capps, whose name you saw, who's the data expert at Census, the domain experts will say, of course you need provenance. Of course you need to know where this data came from, and how do you say that X% of people in London are Asians or whatever it is, right? But that's the domain expert talking. What about, so the question to all of you who are building solutions is, what is it that your users might actually want? And have you ever tried this experiment where we say, it's like an A/B kind of experiment. Put the button and say, I can give you more, and don't put the button. See what happens. Right?
So I've spent a big part of my career building data provenance systems, and it's a very depressing part because I build these systems, and then only people want provenance when things go wrong. And then we don't have the provenance because nobody bothered to collect it, but they really want it when things go wrong, but normally they're happy. This is my experience.
But that's still saying something, so that's good. At least they want it. I don't know how they figured out it went wrong, because maybe it gave the answer they didn't expect and said, hey, what's wrong with this?
No, I think that's actually very insightful, though, that people want provenance when things go wrong. I think that's especially the case with scientists. When the data is showing something other than what they thought it would show, then they have to really check to see how that came to be, to make sure it isn't really a data problem, right? And that it's actually that isn't about how it was produced, but that it actually is reflective of something going on in the world. That's when they start checking, really, right? That's when it really matters to them. And so then that's when it becomes really important too, because it is about securing a kind of a fact or a truth, right? I'm not going to be able to answer the whole of what you're asking. You're asking like a really, really big question, right? This is like an enormous question in the social sciences. What is context? And then now it's transferred over to this question of what is the context of data, or what is the context of the production of a kind of knowledge. That it's huge. It's an enormous question and really debated in the field. But one thing I will tell you, that we often think, people often think when you're talking about context, you're talking about what's going on over there. But a sort of basic social science insight is context is something that we do now about then. Context is something that we, right now, we're telling a story about something that happened before. And so the question really is, what do you need today to tell a meaningful story about before? That's really what metadata is actually about. Sometimes people think it's about capturing the past, fully capturing what occurred in the past. That gets you into a lot of trouble, because then you sort of have to have these assumptions about what you think. You're not thinking about the future, you're thinking about the now. But context is actually about the future. It's like today we're building a context for what happened for those data in the past. And so it's about having to reconstruct a kind of narrative of the past what's trickiest of all, and I think you're really getting at, is you don't really know what you're going to need to tell a story today about before. Right? It's really hard to know that, and that's why we have such trouble capturing all those pieces. But the best insight I can give you is like stop thinking about context as like what is happening right now and what's relevant, but like what might be relevant in the future to create a narrative about what occurred in the past.
Just a line. King died, queen died. And king died, queen died because of heartbreak, is what contest is all about. And I'm interested in that than knowing only king died and queen died.
Queen has actually died 2 months
And
ago.
queen
I was
died
wondering
because of
whether you-
heartbreak. Because of heartbreak is a story. It's not a data.
May I I'm just going to throw this in the room. So 2 weeks ago, I was on this panel where we were celebrating 10 years of Wikidata. So we were talking about how it all started, and we were all feeling old and wise. And so one of the things that Danny Vrandich said in that panel, so two things really, really interesting, and I wonder how this community feels about it. So he said, when he set it up, he had expected that every researcher in natural language processing would use Wikidata as a knowledge graph everywhere. They would see it used throughout, and that somehow didn't really happen, or it didn't happen at the scale that he thought it would. And then the other thing, which was more like a research interest we had at the time, was around knowledge diversity. And it goes back to what you were saying about capturing the context. So when you publish a data set, you make different types of choices. Depending on the representation, you can have contradicting information within the same model or knowledge base. And one of the design principles of Wikidata was to allow this. So to be able to say, okay, the Earth is flat, Earth is not flat, right? And those views should coexist, and it would have they would have references and so on and so forth. And there is, it turns out that now 10 years down the line, there's very few controversies, literally. In fact, we don't even have the tools, and maybe this is where social scientists could actually help us. We don't even know where to look for them. So we looked in the discussions. We looked in the triples that have been changed back and forth. There's how could it be that in Wikipedia, everyone's arguing all the time, but then in Wikidata, because it's not that they agree on certain facts on a text side and then they put it in Wikidata. That's not how it happens. It sort of goes back and forth a lot. So where's the controversy? What happened with the controversy? We don't know yet. So we found some sort of back and forth discussions, but much less than we ever thought. And then there's a subset of that knowledge base where indeed you have content that is perhaps either considered controversial. I think there was something around abortion and how it was classified. Which anyone can edit at all times, and also a number of triples that were saying they were providing basically contradicting information in terms of values. But then the other thing that the developers were telling us in Wikidata is that no one uses that information. So when it comes to building a question answering system, if you have multiple views on a certain fact, the developers would just discard all but one. So what is it that, how do we build those systems that would be able to use that context productively? And we don't know. And that's just something that I found out, and I thought, oh wow. So I thought I would share it with you.
That makes me think of it really is like the idea of metadata today is incredibly thin relative to what we think of as debates. Do you remember at the very beginning when I showed you all those those binders and binders of emails? and that they were they had been printed out and they were going to scan them over again. Why do they keep those over the last 30 years? When I asked them, it's for controversies. It's for when a debate comes up about what they did to produce X kind of data. How did they do like a particular kind of assay with blood or whatever? The only way that they can reconstruct that is by going through their emails and seeing like all the debates that occurred about like, no, we do it like this, or we're looking for this particular thing, or we're using this reagent or whatever, and they're going back and forth and debating it. And that's what they often use during like a controversy, a scientific controversy, to decide what they did and like what they should do next, how they should interpret their data. And so they often say to me things like the idea of metadata is so thin, you know, like who said what, and like the data point at like with a timestamp or something like that. That is almost nothing compared to the richness that is contained in their emails deciding about things. It's a very different version of metadata.
And just a quick, interesting example of somehow there are some cases of where knowledge graphs provide context and metadata or provenance that is actually useful. Mostly, I think many of us have seen them in specific cases, right? One of the interesting questions is how to achieve it at such a big level that Elena described. Let me give an example of where one sees it quite effectively. In a recent project on medical knowledge graphs, which are always kind of the topic is a carefully handled topic, that had NLP techniques, machine learning techniques, logic-based reasoning techniques, and data stemming from many sources. So you have this provenance in 10,000 directions, type of reasoning, machine learning, so typical, the different types of machine learning, including particular NLP techniques and so on, all acting together. And the most important effect of the knowledge graph in this case was actually, in many cases, taking all of those sources together, summarizing them, presenting when a particular query or a particular question came to the knowledge graph, presenting a simple answer, but being able to dig down deeper into the provenance of that specific query. Why is this system now saying something particular about this patient and this drug? Okay, this is because in these 10,000 reports, our system thinks that there was probably this drug is in reality this drug because the physician made a typo in the report and things like that. And somehow, I don't have statistics how often actually this is used. Because as you said before, people only care when something goes wrong. So when a decision that doesn't make sense from a medical side is made, then they ask. But then one thing I think that the technical side of our field, so the computer science, non-social side has to offer here is usually that contradictions can exist next to each other, like Eleanor said, and on the knowledge graph, there's nothing, often people don't understand that in a knowledge base and knowledge graph there cannot exist 5 different definitions of the same thing. No problem. It all depends on what is presented to the user and how it's summarized and how we can dig down in this summary. And second, a quick thing on basically these arguments. Maybe some of you know it, but there's a full field of computer science on computational argumentation that mostly focuses on how to actually do reason on arguments. And it's quite a fascinating field. Just mentioning it because I know a colleague who does this basically full time as the main research area. So one never stops learning there.
So about this, going back to the controversies, and we couldn't find any in Wikidata. So I'm sure they're there, and I'm sure I'm going to find them, but it's harder than I thought. So around 2003, 4, 5, when we were building these manual knowledge bases, this whole area of argumentation was very popular among knowledge engineers, and because we were doing these projects in small teams where there was lots of fights. People were discussing every single bit of the conceptualization. So there is some work which could be revisited around going and looking at argumentation frameworks, going through discussions and mining those sort of structured argumentation flows and sort of trying to summarize where the main pain points are, which could be revisited, and I'm sure we have much better tools to build those argumentation networks now. But there's also, I think, there's work that looks at argumentation as a tool to generate explanations.
That was all from one question,
Yeah,
right?
maybe
So,
people want to ask other things.
yeah, let's move on.
Any comments? Yeah.
I mean, thank you so much. This is a very fascinating discussion. And you've touched a lot of interesting points. But basically, there was this assumption, let's say, underlying assumption that the understanding of computers is different than the understanding of humans. But, I mean, don't you think that, I mean, so going forward, we are kind of going into a representation of knowledge for machines and for humans that is basically converging. So that we should represent knowledge and controversy and, provenance in the same way as we teach to a human, exactly the same way as we teach to a machine. So basically, not really trying to impose any structure or to extract any structure from text, but mainly expose the information as it is to a machine and see, but teach basically the end goal to the machine. Try to teach by instruction, by explanations. I'm wondering, what do you think on this?
Boy, that sounds awfully philosophical. My immediate thought there is, at least the level at which I'm thinking about it now, is what are you teaching the machine? You might be teaching the machine the wrong thing, or at least the incomplete thing. So that raises the question, what is complete? So I used to go around, last time I was at NSF, because, I suppose when you're in government kind of things, you're looking at a much bigger picture of what's going on. And I used to say, the internet is not the whole population. Surprise, right? There are a lot of people who are not on the internet, or a lot of people who are cannot access the internet. There are a lot of people who don't think of doing a search on the web as the first thing to do when something happens to them. That's what I mean by, So there are huge missing parts of the population. And I'm talking about the United States, which is like one of the top economies, the top economy. So forget about other countries. So that's my mission. So your thing is about sort of representation of thought and those kind of things in humans, knowledge in human versus computer. But at some point, the computer is not yet going around observing. So at some point, it's the humans who are feeding it. And one of the concerns I have, and I think a lot of people have, is what is it that we are feeding it? And as you heard, there are some things that are missing, that are in the real world. And increasingly, the world is becoming diverse, right? I mean, there was a time when the US was dominant, I would say, in computer science. It's no longer the case. So now this is happening everywhere. Actually, I was going to come to this later on. One of the things I'm wondering is a forum like this might need to move across the world. In other words, have workshops like this in India, in China, Europe, US. And David's point was even in the US, actually US is not a homogeneous place. There are places in the US that are quite different from each other. And what is the social understanding there? So that's my reaction to.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting thought, and we could discuss perhaps what you mean by representation. It's probably going to be a spectrum, right? And typically, when I think about human readable versus machine readable representations, when I think about the human side, I think about an application or a task or someone with a certain persona, let's put it this way, doing something, wanted to do something, and it just happens that there is a knowledge representation or a data representation to serve that purpose. And when you look at it from that point of view, I don't know if the representations are the same. But just to stay on the human side, I think if you go back to the knowledge acquisition field from the 90s and the 80s, one of the papers that you had at the beginning, so there's all those studies that tell you that if you ask, if you point to a bird in the sky and you ask 10 different people what that is, they will tell you, they will be at a different level of abstraction depending on their expertise, right? And then, say, perhaps the overall representation is the same, but people will be comfortable only in some parts of that graph, depending on their background. Then, if you look across the world, we are used to think about these graphs with these ontologies and sort of Aristotelian view of the world where there's things and then they're there and there, and then there's these abstract classes and whatnot. But there's alternative ways to see things, which, I mean, I'm ignorant about them, but I understood that there's other cultures that look less at things and categories and more at processes and transitions. And in those cultures, having categories and subcategories of things with relationships between them is not the most natural way they think about the world. And the fact that our knowledge graphs are still structured in this Western way, and we haven't really tried out anything else, is still quite a big surprise for me. So I'd love if someone else would actually look in depth at these alternative ways to do it and work with that. So those would be my immediate thoughts. But I'm biased because I've worked so much with people who try to do things that happen to have some sort of knowledge structure in the back end, that I have to answer in this way.
Actually, I do now have my second thought is quite philosophical, because you talked about machines representing human, right? One of the tracks that I mentioned, machine knowledge being human knowledge being represented, and the melding of the two. One of the tracks in the accelerator thing that I mentioned earlier, Open Knowledge Network was one, but there's another track going on right now on disinformation, misinformation, basically. So misinformation is clearly a human thing, right? Humans love misinformation. If you don't believe it, come to the US, I'll show you, okay? There are people who believe 0 is 1, and 1 is also 1, I guess, I don't. It's actually true. There are people who believe that what did not happen actually happened, okay? So that's why you have, I hardly use social media, as I was saying, I use only WhatsApp. Most of what I get on WhatsApp is crap, excuse the language, right? It's nonsense. So the machine is reflecting what the humans want. Humans just love false stuff. So that's my philosophical response to your thing is, yes, we are doing it. We are representing in the machine what the humans like to do.
I want to tackle that one too. I know, but I want to tackle this question though. Since we're on it, you'll still get your question. Actually, I'm gonna bump you up too, so you're gonna like this comment. One of the underlying, I think, there's a kind of underlying discussion that's been going on that since I've gotten to AKBC, and I've been watching it from further, which is this idea of like the automated knowledge base, and I think it's part of your question in some sense. And there's this distinction that runs very strongly through this community of like handcrafted to automated, right? That this is like a definite thing that's occurring. Once we were handcrafters of knowledge, once we did things by talking to people and then writing it down, and now some kind of like automated thing is occurring. Now, I don't want to like fully get rid of that distinction, right? But I am suspicious of it, of it being like once we were this and now we're that. And I've hung out with people who are like handcrafters of knowledge, and I've hung out with machine learning-ish NLP people, and like there's an awful lot of human labor involved still. You know, me as an ethnographer who watches people, I still see y'all doing work. You know, like I still like go places, and when I see NLP people, they're still like I can still observe the work. You know, it's not like you're not there anymore as people. And so, and yeah, you're working with like new tools and you're working with more data, but the idea that that it's automated, meaning there's not people involved is something that just like is not observably correct. Right, like I can see this is not the case, and if that's true, then you also have to. And so, like Elena, the way you put it was like all the issues that you used to see when you were like in your old school world of handcrafting, and now you're transferred to this world. You're still seeing the issues, right?
Yeah, they're just slightly different.
They're slightly different. Of course, they're inflected by something that's occurred. The tool set is changing. The practice is changing. I'm not denying that, but the idea that we've moved from that like handcrafted to automated also means from like human to non-human or post-human or something is not correct. And so I think there's a vocabulary and conceptual set of issues there that we need to work out a little better to understand like what world are we in now that we're more in this like machine learning, data-driven, but still like populated by many people all over the place as practitioners. And so how do we think through that? And I think like one way that we might think about that is like the reconfiguration of work, or what we call in sociology the division of labor. The labor is still there, it's just occurring in different places using different kinds of tools. You know, like the Industrial Revolution did not mean that we went from everything was like crafted, like everyone was sewing by hand and then it was sewn by machines. No, we still had laborers, they're just in different places doing different things, and it matters. So we still want to think about that today too. What kind of like reconfiguration of labor has occurred, and what does that mean for the way that we're representing knowledge and capturing them in these knowledge bases today?
Yeah, and I think just judging from interacting with my PhD students, who are lovely people and a small sample, I think going back to both of them are there, they're looking at me. So I think what you're saying about that manual labor versus automatic is quite interesting, because at least from my experience, I think it used to be that handcraft, that artisan part of building the knowledge base was something really interesting. I mean, you are basically a philosopher, you are thinking about the nature of things, and now none of my students want to touch anything that doesn't have a data set already linked to it. I don't want to have to do this, it takes lots of time, I have to do crowdsourcing, I have to apply for ethics. So the reputation of that craft has, at least based on my anecdotal evidence, changed quite a bit. And people want to stay as close to the automation as possible, because they see that as the fascinating, as the interesting, as the sexy part of the whole process.
I just wanted to say that it's ages that we as humans curate knowledge, uncrafted knowledge. I mean, that will not go away. So, but I think we should create knowledge and keep creating knowledge as we did all our life as human beings in a way that is understandable both from a human but also for a machine. I don't think you need to do the distinguish anymore. You don't need to distinguish between representation anymore.
Okay, so I'm going to one-up this by saying, actually, referring first to a wonderful talk by Brett Victor. If you know him, he's like one of the interface designers of the iPad or Pod and a lot of things in that space. And he has this talk on the humane representation of thought. And the main sort of hypothesis of that talk is that, you know, even what we think now, like humans do to share knowledge, namely mostly symbolic writing down of language and maybe like a diagram or something like that, that's already a really inhumane way of representing knowledge, because it restricts us with all of our senses and just nails it down to like a bit of reading and visual sort of interpretations of symbols. And so he argues for, I guess, going more into dynamic systems you interact with that represent knowledge, right? Like, and thinking about how you learn to ride a bike. That's something that you cannot write down, but even things that we maybe write down now, they can probably be represented in better ways. And now my feeling is, if I think about the traditional field of knowledge representation, they're going exactly the opposite way, in the sense that they're making it even worse by saying, look, I don't even give you language. I'm going to give you triples in some ontology that you now need to squeeze in your thoughts, which seems like the most inhumane thing we can do. So shouldn't we maybe generally think more about better representations for knowledge? And this is sort of where I'm agreeing with Fabio, right? Like rather think about better representations for human knowledge and how they share knowledge, and less about how machines can then do stuff with it, which I feel is one of the underlying hypotheses or goals of knowledge representation. So anyway, what's your
I
thought
don't
on
have
that?
any issue with that, and I think absolutely. So language and diagrams are or tables, right? They're quite restrictive and quite a narrow reductionist view on the whole area. And absolutely we should have better algorithms to be able to process all sorts of representations, right? All sorts of human representations of thought. I think for me that's all great. I do want to have, as a human, means to control and interact with those systems, those machine systems. Say, for instance, any of these big machine learning models that we see examples of just how smart they are all the time. If I want to have, as a lay person, I want to be able to go and I see a representation of something, a picture that's been created, I have some sort of feedback about it, I want to be able to write it down somehow or express it somehow, and I want to have a means to see that taken into account and represented, right? So as long as I have that feedback loop at the level of my own AI literacy, I think I'm perfectly comfortable with it. And in the end, I agree with you. It doesn't matter so much what the representation is, as long as we are inclusive and give people means to interact with the systems that come out of it. I think it, just to flag another interesting talk, perhaps. So in 2017, Jamie Taylor from the knowledge graph at Google gave this really interesting talk about the stuff that they don't capture in the knowledge graph and can't capture. So I think he was saying that something like 40,000 or 60,000, there's 60,000 entities in the Google search engine that they don't have in the knowledge graph per second. So just the range of things that they don't have. And one of the areas that he didn't know how to capture was very much along what you were saying. So things that are implicit, things that, and the challenge that he threw at us was, how do I do that? Where do I take it from? What sort of models do I need to build to extract that? But he was exactly after that, because it is a huge issue. No matter how big that knowledge graph is, it's never going to be able to, or at least at the moment, with the infrastructure they have, it doesn't capture how to ride a bike. It doesn't capture, I don't know, that. I think his example was people throw coins in fountains and bring flowers to whatever. So it's lots of that tacit, implicit, non-verbal knowledge is not captured.
Yeah, I'll get you. I just want to say, I agree that bringing it back to the social aspects, it doesn't matter at what level you're representing. The social aspects are still there. One of the people who's been engaged with us in the discussions in the context of this OKN is Doug Leonard. Some of you might know, and I can bet you that he's got views on the level at which logic representation has to happen and so on. But here we are talking about what are the social aspects regardless of which level you're trying to represent this.
just to quickly comment on that, I'm not making an argument for different kind of representations underneath. I'm thinking we should, like, to be really in there for humans, we should think more about new ways of representing knowledge for them than to even think about how machines can process it or not and what they do. So in a way, that talk was saying, look, what if we could enable anybody to really quickly build a interactive mechanical model of what they think and then share that with you, right? Like, which I think is going beyond, can you extract information from this existing thing to, what humans already did in this really inhumane way that we have been representing knowledge for so long. And so I feel like that has a social angle as well, because it restricts us as human and social beings. But anyway, yeah.
There's a phrase from, there's a methods phrase from the field of history that is called the managerial bias. So I think history should be more interesting for y'all, for like database people, than you think, because they're a field that has been long concerned with dealing with like traces of things that are very partial, that they have to reconstruct something out of, but that are left in like little bits and pieces. And so for a long time, they've dealt with the incomplete record. They've dealt with the biased record. And so, and I think that there's something to be learned from that for database people, because you're also working with like thin traces of the world that are left behind. That's what I think of data as. And so the managerial bias specifically refers to the tendency for the things that get recorded and preserved in history are the things of managers. And so it's things like, if you look back like 2,000 years, the things that we have are like lists from administrators of, Egyptian or Mesopotamian empires were saying like, well, we need to make sure that there's less people who are littering. No, that's not what they care about, right? But like old records of administrators are what we have from thousands of years ago. We have like laundry lists of people who are like doing their tasks and keeping track of populations. But this goes all the way through. So like colonial historians will also be like, the most proliferous records of colonialism are by the colonists, obviously because they were administrating, right? Like they're monitoring the people and the populations and the flows of records. And this goes all the way across. Like it's not just political, it goes right down to say like in the sciences, when a historian of science wants to track the history of the geosciences, you have much more records from the geoscientists who won the battles, right? Like, so people like geophysicists who have, like, we now believe the world is geophysical, and not the people who are like the flat earthers, right? There's very little data from the flat earthers. There's a lot of data from the geophysicists. Why? Because they won and they populated the archives with their data and they preserved those data. This is true at like sort of every level. And so the managerial bias sort of gets you the idea that like certain people produce records for certain reasons and those get kept and other records just don't get produced at all or don't get kept, preserved and pushed towards the future, right? That isn't gonna go away now that we're like in a kind of data world. All the instruments that we're building of the world today are driven by certain kinds of interests. They're producing data about some things and not other things, and they're keeping data and circulating data and producing good metadata and good archives about some things and not other things. The managerial bias should be, I think, something that we should think about in these kinds of fields because it tells us that the data we're working on, when you say your students are really into like the databases, I'm like, oh, well, those only produce certain things, right? Like only certain things make it to be databases. Other things don't. What are those biases of what gets recorded? And even like deeper, like what instruments are produced to produce certain kinds of data and not other kinds of data?
I like the discussion on the representations because, and also what you mentioned right now, because we have two things there, right? One is, and I'm fully on the point of the actual representation that is behind the knowledge graph, the open knowledge network, the whatever. That's a secondary question to how we interact with it. And somehow the question is, what is a natural way of interaction with it? I think two interesting concrete points came up, namely, okay, representing knowledge in a way that is good for humans to interact with, which raises an interesting question. Is the good old textbook a good way of representing knowledge for humans? Is that kind of what history shows as the optimal way of representing human knowledge. Probably a lot of people would disagree. Some people would say probably it's in all of these options a good sweet spot. And then to your point on, actually, if you look at it from historical record, you see tables. That's quite funny. I'm originally a databases person, so it's quite funny to think of this perspective, and so kind of the open question of that probably learning education scientists have asked themselves for quite a lot of time. Now, if the answer is what humans should represent knowledge as and machines shouldn't differ, so what's the best way for humans? Interesting questions. I don't have answers, but I found it interesting.
Oh, no, you're right. So I actually think people invent ways of representing knowledge that's useful for them all the time, right? It's like my favorite one now is like TikTok, right? And my favorite TikTok channel is Miss Excel. It's fantastic. You should go there. VS Lookup, amazing way to learn how to do VS Lookup, I tell you. So maybe I super agree with you that in AKBC, right, maybe we should be looking more at how can we answer people's questions and the data representation as it naturally comes from what people are doing, right? So I'm missing the paper on short form video, answering questions over there. I mean, we do now stuff with longer form video, but there's all these representations that people are used that get invented all the time by people, right? Like, we don't need to invent them. They do it themselves because they find it useful or interesting or exciting. So TikTok knowledge.
I have no problem with TikTok. I think what I was thinking actually about this, how to ride a bike example, and how would you want to share that? And I suppose it's a matter really of, I don't think, just to defend the knowledge graph people, I don't think knowledge graph practitioners say everyone should think about their lives in triples. I mean, you would be amazed about the sort of rows we have in our community, because I don't write down my knowledge in triples, and then there's people in my community saying, how dare you not do, if we don't do it in triples, who else should we do? So no, I'm not one of those people. But I think just like we train some people to be database engineers, if this graph representation is useful for something internally, we could indulge them. And if we indulge them, there's going to be a lot of interesting topics that they will want to explore about what happens if you have 20 knowledge graphs and they evolve, and sort of data integration. So it's a specialist topic. No one says you should only code in triples, ideally with some sort of weird XML syntax as well. But say the interesting project I'm gonna keep an eye on, and I was talking to some people about this in the break. So Wikipedia, they have this new project called Abstract Wikipedia, where they're thinking about what they call language independent representations of articles. And they see this as a way to sort of help some of the smaller Wikipedias grow. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment going on in that team about what those representations should be and how would they look like, and they have this thing called wiki functions, which are essentially sort of like atom functions that do simple things like converting from one unit of measurement to another, and the idea would be that editors in whatever language actually build this library of procedural representations, and then they built some sort of Turing complete engine that will take that and will be able to generate some sort of text or maybe other representation as well at the other end. But I think that's a fascinating project to watch, just because of the scale it can have, what when it launches, because there's going to be lots of people. Obviously, Wikipedia editors are not a representative sample for the rest of the population, but they're also much more representative, perhaps, than scientists and IT people. So I'd be very interesting to. I learned a lot from Wikidata just looking at how editors who never thought about talking in triples represent the world very differently from what I used to know, and I hope. I mean, I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot about these abstract representations just by watching them, how they encode things.
And to follow up on the graph representation, I mean, we had some examples where graphs are probably the most inhumane and unnatural representation of things. But looking now at the historical perspective, where we find tables in 2,000-year-old things and also graphs everywhere, I think it just shows that there are some situations in which a TikTok video is the most natural representation. Some of them where text is the natural one, and then and graphs and database tables. And the one thing we probably must accept is that this is not an either-or, but they will exist on multiple levels, all of these things. Whether it's now a table or a graph or a text, well, in the best case, it doesn't matter as much as we think it matters at the moment. It's as we interact as humans with it that matters.
But you also have to understand where it comes from, right? So it comes from this idea, so it comes from the web. And Tim Berners-Lee thought, and others at that time, wouldn't that be nice if we would have these interlinked documents? Okay. And from that to say, okay, well, so now we have document, link, document. Why don't I have thing, link, thing? Because that's natural, because we trained everyone to do that. And that's essentially what they thought would happen. Well, it didn't happen, except it happened once Google started indexing the triples and it mattered in the search results. Because then everyone all of a sudden started saying, oh, wow, I need my 3 triples for my business on my page so that it's indexed by the search engine. And then there's a few other interesting talks, I think, by people at Facebook about the Open Graph Protocol and how people are using those triple representations and just how bent the knowledge gets when you constrain it into those forms, which I think speaks to this social aspect. There's someone else who has a point if we want.
Online, okay, yeah. Thanks everyone for a fascinating discussion. So I was just curious about the community participation part and how we can significantly scale that up, and first of all, whether there is a need for that as well. I mean, for example, we are talking about, say, video as a representation, short form videos. There's lots of content generation there already happening. Maybe that is kind of like the future of capturing knowledge, and that's already growing, not much to be done there. But then if you think in terms of say Wikipedia, data and all of that, so where there is kind of specific people contributing. Now, if you have to grow that participation, what kind of additional incentive mechanisms we should be thinking about? So right now, probably there's lots of organic interest that people want to contribute, but are there additional incentives and mechanisms we should be thinking about to significantly increase the participation on that side?
So I'm thinking about the TikTok videos. So let's just assume that the knowledge is embedded in these TikTok videos, right? And it's perfectly fine, or it can be embedded in a different representation, and something happened to it. And then, so I suppose then the question of community participation only can be asked in 2 ways. First, what does the influencer on TikTok care about? And they care about views and a number of other things. And then we need to see if there's a way between what they want, which is views, and what we want, which is, I don't know what we would want from them in addition to uploading more content. Maybe we would want them to fix certain things or provide some sort of feedback on very specific issues we would have with the system. So that's one version of the world. In the other, I think it's again about really trying to understand where people can contribute productively at this more technical level, rather than just being content generators, ultimately. And there, I mean, lots of the answers so far have been we crowdsource and we pay, and there's a whole area that is looking at that, and is looking also at how to do that via speech, and how to do that on the mobile phone, and how to do that in various ways. And that's one way to incentivize participation. I think for the rest, in my view, is that there will be a handful of very successful volunteer communities that work. We don't know why they work, and for every single Wikipedia, there's 200 things like Wikipedia that just failed, despite the fact that they looked sort of the same. I haven't found an answer for why certain volunteer communities grow so quickly, and others are much harder to set up or fail. I suppose this is where it shows just how challenging humans are in relation to technology.
Okay. So there is a essay, a book, a New York Times bestseller called On Bullshit by Henry Franklin, and he was from Johns Hopkins University. He's written this essay on 2009, and I really love this. It's a 27-page essay. And On Bullshit essay talks about basically at that point of time in 2009 about social media and the influences of social media, which is mostly about bullshitting. TikTok, I don't have access to TikTok, but there was a time when India was having access to TikTok. Now we don't have. But Instagram Reels are there, which I am very much addicted to, and also Shorts, and there are so many other things. Again, what Sir was talking about, misinformation, I think TikTok, again, is a very fake, artificial kind of world. So if you are taking data from there, you need to think about it, and the kind of representation which is there in TikTok, the access to TikTok, and what kind of people are using it, and how they are creating, and why they are creating it, whether it is discriminatory, or whether it is elite, or whether, you know, the kind of thing, again, the intents are important. So if you think, which is a part of digital humanities, because in digital humanities, now we have started analyzing not literary text, but these kind of things, movies, classics, mangas, anime, and videos. We need to actually understand, because when we talk about books and analyzing books, we know that they are coming from an author, classic, a Shakespeare, you know, has written this book, and we are analyzing it, or the scholars. But TikTok, we really don't know. So it's a perpetual debate, even in digital humanities, what to analyze and why to analyze, and to what extent, and whether this is misinformation, fake information, purely bullshit. So I think this is one thing which we need to consider. Yeah.
So I just want to add that, yes, TikTok as knowledge representation aside, I think your question is about maybe more to the kind of things that Elena was talking about, is how do you incentivize more structured contributions into structured places? So what we are trying to, what the Open Knowledge Network is trying to do, we absolutely want to leverage everything that's in the Wikidata, basically Wikidata sphere, and that way of doing things. But there we are trying to start with government data. So I think it'll succeed if the government, and that's why we have this sort of vertical, horizontal complexity going on, because government agencies would be interested in participating if they see some value out of it, that they put their data and somebody is using it. So that's the use case driven approach. But like I said before, we don't want it to be a bespoke thing. We want it to be like Wikidata, that it's a common resource. One project, you may very well be aware, is Google Data Commons that Guha is doing. And he's bringing in a lot of government data, in fact, and for sustainability. And actually, we're now trying, in fact, I have a call with him next week to see how we can do this all together. They're working with, Stanford has a new school of sustainability, and we're trying to see if, maybe some combination of industry, government, academia could push this forward. At the end of the day, will it succeed is a very cosmic question. Don't know. In my next life, maybe I'll find out.
All right, we're at time, so I want to respect that. I suspect that there will be more things coming along these lines, so stay in touch with us if you're interested. I suspect, maybe now that Chaitan's at NSF, there might be money behind it. We'll see. Which
Talking about incentives.
yeah, yes, that's how things happen.
Sorry.
I was going to wrap up. You want to have something else?
No, just to add, I think it's okay for me to say that I did mention to one of my colleagues in the social science directorate at NSF that we are running this meeting, and he was very interested. He wanted to know what the outcomes would be, so hopefully there will be some follow-on, and I'll let you finish, but I just wanted to thank all these folks who are sitting here for this long. Relatively quiet, but I think they were listening.
So thanks to the panelists, and thanks to you all. That's it. We're done.